Sue West asked if it could be recorded.
Sure. I'll
Okay,
record it
thank you.
and we'll get it to her later tonight.
All righty then. Perfect. Sounds like a good idea. Hi, Marjorie.
Hi, Barb.
Hello. Hi, Lisa.
Are we alone?
No, I don't think so.
Oh, good.
But on your gallery, you'll see a few of your friends.
All right, I'll try and find that.
Hope everyone is well this evening. Glad you can be here for our first of the Lenten After-Dinner programs.
I see you're still in San Francisco, Scott.
Well, would you want to leave San Francisco, Lisa?
You leave your heart there? What is that?
I've never been. I've actually always wanted to go.
Oh, it's so beautiful. But I haven't been there since I was 17 years old. So we basically seem to be in the SoCal part, but I loved San Francisco. So beautiful. Very romantic place, beautiful place. Well, we were pretty much there, I think. Just give everybody one more second. I think there's still some people coming on. And I'll give them just a second to kind of get settled before we begin. And then I'll turn it over to Pastor Scott, just to make sure that we've got it all ready to go. And
We're
then
ready.
I'll start. All right, then. All right. Why don't we begin? And here we go.
So Barb, do you want me to share the first video, or would you like to speak?
No,
first?
I'll give you a cue. I'll
Okay,
just
okay,
go.
right.
Okay. All right. Well, good evening and welcome to this wonderful first after dinner Lenten experience tonight. I'm so privileged to be able to share with you about the spirituals. And tonight we are going to do some exploring, and we're going to think about how the spirituals have impacted us over the years and what they mean for us as Christians and as people who love music, and for people who want to know history. So we'll go into different ways. As a music student at the University of Illinois, I began my love affair with spirituals. I was touched by their beauty and their power, and we performed them often in our choral classes. I even performed Deep River for one of my graduate recitals. I just loved it so much. And as time has gone on, I've developed a deeper understanding of this most unique American artistic expression. In preparation for this Lenten After-Dinner presentation, the journey of discovery led me to appreciate and reverence spirituals even more. I listened to spirituals, and there are so many recordings that you can find on YouTube, and that was sort of a delightful surprise. And what's interesting is how many different venues and how many different people perform them, from recordings by Johnny Cash, the Mormon Tabernacle Choir. And most interesting of all was a choir in Thailand at the university. They were performing in Bangkok for their choral festival. And all of these Thai young people were under the direction of a visiting African-American conductor. So the spirituals spread far and wide. They're not just known to us in the United States. The performances we will experience tonight will incorporate the Fisk Jubilee Singers, Marian Anderson, and the Morehouse College Choir. The spirituals were once referred to as plantation hymns, and they were collected in the late 1800s. Our concert repertoire and our hymnals reflect these spirituals. They're deeply embedded in our musical heritage. And we draw inspiration from this beautiful music, but there is so much more to the story. The spirituals were songs of comfort, songs of defiance, songs of deep longing for freedom, and songs of joy. But they were not limited to songs about the promise of heaven and endurance alone, as I once thought. They were songs that held a deep and secret meaning that would carry escaped slaves to freedom and serve as the theological framework for the Black church. I invite you to explore this music with me tonight. And since it is Lent, my emphasis will be on the spirituals that reflect the themes of suffering and redemption. Now, many of you have seen the movie Harriet. We know we've shown it at church for our movie nights. And Harriet is the story of Harriet Tubman. Her biography, and she was known as the Moses of her people. And they portray in this film really well her deep spirituality. Harriet Tubman used the spirituals as a way of communication. And not only did she use them to build her reserve and her strength to go about and rescue slaves and bring them to freedom, she also used them because she knew the secret language that lie embedded into the spirituals. The film, if you go back and revisit Harriet, you'll hear them singing Wade in the Water in the film. Now, that's not one that Harriet Tubman actually was attracted to, but at least we don't know. Maybe she did, but there's no historical record of it. But in the film, they use Wade in the Water as a way of giving people that moment where they're singing and they know that that's the night. And they know that's the night they're going to escape. And they know that night where they're headed through these dangerous waters they have to cross over. And crossing over into Jordan was a cue word that meant you're going to get to this river, and when you cross, you will be in free territory. I want to start with a sort of a nod to Harriet Tubman tonight. Her very favorite spiritual was Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. And the group that's going to perform it for us tonight they're called the Plantation Singers. And they come from the low country of South Carolina near Charleston. I selected them because I've listened to lots of the Smithsonian recordings of very, very old recordings of spirituals. And this group seems to capture that essence. And so I think it will give us a really good feel for what it would have been like had we been on those evenings. But remember, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot, when I first heard that, even as a child, I think we used to sing it at Girl Scout camp. We learned that song. And the image is either of the prophet Elijah being carried to heaven in a chariot, or when you come to your last days, God is going to take you home. And we see that as this beautiful reflection of being welcomed into the arms of God. But if you were a slave, you saw it as a both and. That was accurate. They also saw it as coming for to carry me home. Where was home? The free states, and eventually it would be Canada, because the free states, once laws were passed that slaves had to be returned to their masters, people were not really totally free till they crossed over into Canada. So Scott, if you would cue that one up, please.
Okay. Tell me if you can't hear anything, but this should work.
All right.
Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming forth to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot. won't you swing down, cherry, stop and let me ride. Swing down, cherry, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, rock me, Lord. Come and easy. I got home on the other side. Swing down, cherry, stop and let me ride. Swing down, cherry, stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, rock me, Lord. I got a hope on the other side. Why don't you swing down, cherry, stop and let me ride. Stop and let me ride. Oh, rock me, Lord, rock me, Lord. Come and easy. I got a home on the other side.
Thank you, Scott.
Of course.
What I'd want you to notice is that the plantation singers were on the balcony of a plantation house. Now, why would I do that? Well, one of the reasons is that there were times where plantation owners would say, we have the best singers. And so as a way of entertaining guests to the plantation, the slaves would be invited to come and sing. And there would be a rivalry sometimes between plantations as to who had the best musicians. These slaves would be brought out to do this, but they knew that there was a subversive language in these spirituals. They weren't doing this to be pleasant, docile, or resigned to their fate. They found this as a deep source of inspiration. Conversely, there were also places where the slaves would not sing where their masters could hear them. Masters would sometimes absolutely refuse to have drums or any kind of music. They felt that they kind of had the idea that the music was giving people strength. So what they would do is go to a place called the Hush Arbor. It would be set off into the fields, perhaps in a wooded area on the plantation where there could be beyond the reach of the master's ears. They would sing, and I found this fascinating. I'd never seen this before, but they would sometimes take cauldrons, turn them sideways, and sing into the cauldron and gather around, and you could hear only in that space. But it was enough to give them that strength that they needed, or to be able to pass on those messages that this is the night we're going to leave, and this is the way you're going to do it. So all of this was done through the music. I am going to rely upon two Black theologians tonight to give us some insight. Howard Thurman and James Cone. For me, Howard Thurman, who is a panentheist, which means his theology includes the all living things and the interrelatedness between God and human, not pantheist, which is a whole different thing. But he always felt that people could find commonality. That was his whole life. James Cone, who was at my alma mater, but many years before me, the father of Black theology, Black liberation theology. And his words, especially his book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, and the spirituals and the blues, give us a lot of insight into what was that moment of why this music came to be. Howard Thurman, grandson of slaves, he was raised by his grandmother, and his childhood was filled with learning. He lived a solitary childhood because he was a boy who didn't really gravitate to the rough play or the kind of boisterous behavior of other kids. He had a very deep reverence for nature. His ministry was deeply influenced later by Quaker practices. He had been a Methodist early on, but the racial barriers that were placed in front of him moved him to Quaker practice, and then he moved on to a different approach altogether, and he kind of defied denominations. In addition to teaching at Howard University, Howard Thurman served as pastor for the Church of the Fellowship of All People, where Scott is right now, San Francisco. And this church was groundbreaking because Howard Thurman went there in 1961 to found a church that was open to everyone, no matter what race, creed, or color you were. He was then appointed as the first African-American dean of the chapel at Boston University, where he mentored a doctoral student named Martin Luther King. He would become known as the chaplain of the civil rights movement. The spirituals, Howard Thurman wrote a book called Deep River, and it's about the spirituals and his deep effect on him and how they were formative in his life. He said, with untutored hands and with a sure artistry and genius created out of a vast vitality, a concept of God was wrenched from the sacred book, the Bible, the chronicle of a people who had learned through great necessity the secret meaning of suffering. This total experience enabled them to reject annihilation and affirm a terrible right to live. And as I mentioned, for James Cone, he graduated with his Master's of Divinity in 1961 at Garrett. And that was the year that Garrett had invited Martin Luther King to come on faculty. But Martin Luther King felt that he could not leave his ministry in the South and very politely refused. We have his letter of of refusal at Garrett. It's a proud artifact that we have there. James Cone earned an additional master's and doctorate from Northwestern and Garrett, which was a combined program at the time. He became a professor of theology at Union in New York, Union Theological Seminary. His groundbreaking work as the founder of Black liberation theology has provided a very powerful examination of suffering, oppression, and redemption to make the gospel relevant to the life and struggles of American Blacks and to help Black people learn to love themselves. He has written extensively on the spirituals, and his words remind us, and I quote, "Artists force us to see things that we do not want to look at because they make us uncomfortable with ourselves and the world we created." We're going to go into the next spiritual tonight. It's Wade in the Water. I already kind of alluded to that a few minutes ago. But before we play it, I want to share with you what Howard Thurman wrote about Wade in the Water. And he said, let's ponder the 5th chapter of the Gospel of John. So I'm going to read to you that little bit of the 5th chapter of Gospel of John in the King James Version. The reason I'm using the King James Version is because the words in Wade in the Water use the words that come from the King James translation. That's what the slaves knew. They didn't have any of our modern New Revised Editions or Living Bibles or anything like that. They used and heard these words, and that's why Wade in the Water has trouble the waters. That's in the King James Version. So this is the story. After this, there was a feast of the Jews, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. Now there is at Jerusalem, by the sheep market, a pool, which is called in the Hebrew tongue Bethesda, having 5 porches. In these lay a great multitude of impotent folk, of blind, halt, withered, waiting for the moving of the water. For an angel went down at a season into the pool and troubled the water. Whosoever then first, after the troubling of the water, stepped in was made whole of whatsoever disease he had. And a certain man was there, which had an infirmity that was 38 years long. When Jesus saw him lie and knew what he had been, now a long time in that case, he saith unto him, wilt thou be made whole? And the impotent man answered him, Sir, I have no man. And when the water is troubled, to put me into the pool. But while I am coming, another steppeth down before me. Jesus saith unto him, Rise, take up thy bed and walk. And immediately the man was made whole, and took up his bed and walked. And on the same day was the Sabbath. Howard Thurman reflects on Wade in the Water, saying, they took the imagery of the simple New Testament story and applied it to their own situation. For them, the troubled waters meant the ups and downs, the vicissitudes of life. And with the context of the troubled waters of life, there are healing waters because God is in the midst of the turmoil. Within the context of wading the water, the hope for escape depends on God, troubling the waters to set the enslaved people free, to protect them from the pursuers. Think about the Pharaoh pursuing the Israelites. Water offers healing, protection to the enslaved, but danger and death to the slave owner. When slaves went into the water, the dogs couldn't track the scent. And that is another important aspect of using water as a hiding place and as a place to cross over. James Cone reminds us that the spiritual then is the spirit of the people struggling to be free. It is their religion, their source of strength in a time of trouble. And if one does not know what trouble is, then the spiritual cannot be understood. Tonight, the Fisk Jubilee Singers will bring us Wade in the Water. Scott? You'll notice in that performance that it's held back a bit. It isn't a boisterous performance, but it's almost like a hush song. It gives us that feeling of that warning. This is going to be the night, and this is what we're going to do. It's also a call and response. You notice you had a solo voice, and then you had the choir. That was very African. And that African sense of music was very much carried into the music of the spirituals and the development of the spirituals. I'd like to say a word about this performance. Fisk University, I don't know how many of you know where that is. Fisk University is located in Nashville, Tennessee, and it is the home of the Fisk Jubilee Singers. It was founded in 1866 as the first American university that offered a liberal arts education to people of any race, and people of color went there. In 1871, the university was in dire financial distress, and a small group of students was selected to go on a musical tour singing the spirituals. The choir was made up of former slaves or children of slaves, and they performed music that was previously only known to Black people or perhaps slave owners whose plantations were graced with some of the music. The meanings of the spirituals had been carefully kept secret and guarded and never heard outside of the churches that the Black population attended after the war. The Fisk Choir introduced the spiritual to the world, and in doing so, their success saved Fisk University. The Fisk Jubilee Choir was a phenomenon, but it should be noted, this was a groundbreaking moment for them to go out and sing. They went to different churches throughout in Ohio and in various areas near Tennessee. This was the first time that white audiences saw actual Black performers. Up to then, the only Black performers they saw were white performers wearing blackface as minstrels. So this caused, in some places, a reverence and an awe for the music, and in other, they faced a great many challenges as this Fisk group went along. Well, they started to gain more and more popularity, and here's their connection to Chicago. This turned the tide. They were singing in Ohio in a church that had been doing fundraising for the great Chicago fire victims. And that night they were almost out of money, but the Fisk Choir said, take the money we've earned and put it toward that. Well, it made the newspapers in Ohio, and then suddenly other churches wanted these folks to come. And eventually they were invited to the White House by President Ulysses S. Grant. They did a European tour and sang Go Down Moses for Queen Victoria. The Czech composer Antonín Dvořák, you probably all are familiar with the New World Symphony. He drew his inspiration from the spirituals. Dvořák believed the spiritual was the foundation of truly American music. Many of you who know the New World Symphony know the piece Going Home. It is not a spiritual, but Dvořák had such a heart for the spirituals, he was able to capture that essence in his symphony. He also had the man who would eventually, Burley was his name. He became Dvořák's assistant as Dvořák became a conductor in New York. And what he ended up doing was Burley would be the first person to actually set the spirituals down into recorded manuscript. And in fact, when I sang Deep River, it was his arrangement. And that's the arrangement you'll hear later tonight. We're going to go on to the next spiritual that I know many of you know and have a deep love for. Were You There? James Cone says the spirituals, gospel songs and hymns focused on how Jesus achieved salvation for the least through his solidarity with them, even unto death. Howard Thurman said, Jesus suffered, he died, but not alone. They were with him. They knew what he suffered. It was a cry of the heart that found a response and an echo in their woes, and they entered into the fellowship of his suffering. It's interesting to note where Were You There figured into Howard Thurman's life. In his words, some time ago, when a group of Negroes from the United States visited Mahatma Gandhi, and that was him, it was the song that he requested for them to sing to him. The insight here revealed is profound and touching. At last, there is worked out the kind of identification and suffering that makes the cross universal in its deepest meaning. It cuts across the differences of religion, race, class, and language, and dares to affirm that the key to the mystery of the cross is found deep within the heart of the experience itself. As you listen, note, were you there? The immediacy of it. It's as if someone's asking you, and you were a witness along with the person who's singing. I used this a cappella group called Pegasus because there are 3 women singing, and I thought about the women at the foot of the cross. Scott?
Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Oh, it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Oh, it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when they laid him in the tomb? Were you there when the stone was rolled away? Were you there when the stone was rolled away? Oh, it causes me to tremble, tremble. Were you there when the stone was rolled away?
Thank you, Scott. The next spiritual we're going to consider is Deep River. Howard Thurman opens his meditation on Deep River with a poem by Langston Hughes. It's interesting to know who Langston Hughes was. He was a poet of the Harlem Renaissance in the 20s. And New York's Black cultural mecca was roaring with artists and poets and musicians at that time, all located in Harlem, New York. Langston Hughes wrote this poem when he was quite young, And we'll listen to a recording of Langston Hughes reading The Negro Speaks of Rivers from his collection, The Dream Keeper.
This is The Negro Speaks of Rivers, one of my earliest poems written in 1920, just after I came out of high school. The way this poem came to be written was that I was going to Mexico to visit my father, who lived in Mexico City, and on the train going across the Mississippi River, just outside St. Louis, I looked out the window and I saw this great muddy river flowing down toward the heart of the South, and I began to think about what this river meant to the Negro people, how, in a sense, our history was linked to this river, how in slavery time my grandmother told me that to be sold down the Mississippi was one of the worst things that could happen to a Negro slave. And then I remembered that I'd read about Abraham Lincoln going down the Mississippi as a young man, and he went on a raft to New Orleans, and he saw human beings bought and sold in the slave market there, and he was so horrified by this that he never forgot it. And many years later, of course, we know that it was Lincoln who signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And so as the train went on into the gathering dusk, because it had been about sunset when we crossed the river, I took my father's letter out of my pocket and began to write down on the back of his letter this poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. I've known rivers ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
Howard Thurman believed that Deep River is perhaps the most universal in insight, and in his words, certainly the most intellectual of the spirituals. He reflects on the universality of Deep River in this way. The fascination of the flowing stream is a constant source of wonder and beauty to the sensitive mind. It was ever thus. The restless movement, the hurrying, ever-changing stream, has ever been the bearer of the longings and yearnings of humankind for land beyond the horizon, where dreams are fulfilled and deepest desires satisfied. For James Cone, he suggests that there are two basic meanings of the Jordan River as a symbol in African American spirituals. First, the Jordan represented death, a death that was typically seen as liberation from the harsh realities of slave life. Thus, crossing Jordan was a theme of going home to restore a community lost in oppression and slavery. Second, the Jordan could also represent the border between slavery and freedom. And so the other side of the Jordan could just as often suggest the northern states, even Canada, and thus freedom. Tonight, we'll hear Marian Anderson sing Deep River. For those of you who remember the story, Marian Anderson was refused the ability, a noted concert singer, was refused the ability to sing in the Daughters of the American Revolution Hall, in their concert hall in Washington, D.C. This upset Eleanor Roosevelt so much she canceled her membership in the DAR, and it was arranged for Marian Anderson to sing on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Some days later, she was invited to perform for King George VI and Queen Elizabeth at the White House. It is most interesting to note that when she began searching for her teacher to be able to study classical voice, her audition piece was Deep River, and the man who would become her teacher was dissolved into tears. Marian Anderson and Deep River.
Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Deep river, my home is over Jordan. Deep river, Lord, I want to cross over into campground. Oh, don't you want to go to the gospel feast? But promise, Lord, where all is Lord, I want to cross over into campground.
Our final spiritual is called Take My Mother Home. I discovered this spiritual some years ago when I was preparing one of our Good Friday services. And I was just touched by the immediacy and the power of it. And it reminds me of, I think it illustrates what James Cone was talking about in the book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, where he sees this symbiotic relationship between the two. And he talks about suffering, and he talks about brutality, and he also talks about redemption. This piece, you'll know just exactly what's going on here. It is taking the last shred of dignity out of a situation where there isn't any. And we'll close with Take My Mother Home, sung by Morehouse College Choir. Morehouse College was the alma mater of Howard Thurman, where he read every book in the library.
I think I heard him say
shower? Did you just get out of the shower? What's in my hair? Because I'm straight.
Hey, Jen, you might want to mute your microphone if you don't mind. Thank you so much.
Maybe we should start it over, Scott.
You will. Let me just-
Okay, thanks.
hold on a second. Let's just make sure I'm going to mute
Whoops,
everybody.
that would be helpful.
Okay, I've muted everyone. And Barb, just take note when we're done with the video to unmute yourself. Okay. So here we go.
When he was strong.
Well, thank you for exploring these Lenten spirituals with me tonight. There are another cadre of spirituals that would be very wonderful for the Easter season as well. And they have a very different feel. But to me, especially this last one, it shakes me to the core. And I think we can get an experience sometimes of people that we can read about and we can hear about and we can study about it. But when we hear it in music, it makes it all sensible. So thank you for joining me tonight. And if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer.
That was beautiful, Barb. Thank you so very much. You did a tremendous job. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you. It's my pleasure.
That was beautiful. When was that Morehouse recorded? When was that recorded? Do you know?
It was more recent. It was 2009. But what they did was it was part of the video, or the YouTube that they did was sort of a retrospective. So they were showing all the choir with old photographs up to now. So that's where the
Wonderful.
Barb,
yes, Judy. Hello.
sorority, some of my sorority members sing with that choir.
Really?
Yes, Delta Sigma Theta.
Oh my gosh.
Yes.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. It's it just amazing. And the things you find out, when you do these deep dives. I mean, I had no idea. I knew about Fisk's Jubilee Singers, but I had no idea what their background was. And that was just remarkable to me how much I learned with that.
It is.
A wonderful presentation, Barb.
Thank you.
Very touching.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that, Jim. It was
Well, it's
my
nice.
pleasure.
It's nice to be able to go to sleep with those beautiful songs in one's soul. It really is. Thank you.
Mhm. The power in them. I mean, it's
Oh, yeah.
you can't believe it, and you can't believe the fact that it all would have been lost, or at least never brought to the attention that it received. Had it not been, it was interesting. Fisk was founded by what is now the United Church of Christ, but was then called, I think, the American Missionary Society, and they're the ones that founded the school. And so it was a white man who got this idea to go on the road. And of course, they needed someone who wasn't Black to shepherd them, because they had a terrible time finding places to live and to sleep for the night. And I mean, the whole story is remarkable. But he was a musician himself. And when he heard that music, he just couldn't let it go.
Barb, it was such a wonderful presentation. I mean, the time it must have taken you to put all this together, find these videos, weave it together, give us the background. And it was so succinctly and artfully done. It was just beautiful. So first, thank you for that. I think the story that I just keep thinking about is the one you told on the plantations, and how, I'm a saxophonist, and part of when you're learning jazz, they teach you the history of jazz. And so you learn about how jazz emerged from the spirituals and these songs on the plantations. But I had never heard this story of the hush harbors and how music sustained them, and they'd have to sing in secret from the masters. And I mean, just, it breaks your heart, but it also speaks to the power of music. And I mean, that's something we as Methodists understand very much, and people of faith in general. But it just takes on a whole different richness when you think about how it's literally kept their spirits going through these times. And then even you broaden out and think about how through that suffering emerged this incredible, beautiful gift that is jazz, that later became rock and roll, that has just kept evolving and became such a part of America. It's just, I don't know, it's just really touching to me. You'd love James Cone's books, The Spirituals and the Blues, because I think as a saxophonist, that would, it would be in your wheelhouse. And as a theologian, as you are, Scott, you'd find it very interesting. I've read some of James Cone in seminary, but I'll have to read that. That does sound very interesting. Yeah.
Just, he died in 2018. He just passed not too long ago, but just really interesting. When you think about the enormity of the music, when my first lecture for the Religious Education Association was on aesthetics, and I was talking about aesthetics because of one of my people that read my PhD thesis. He said, "Well, so where's the counter argument?" And I said, "On creativity, I don't think there is one." He said, "Well," and I thought about it, and he said, "No, it's an apologetic. It's a fine dissertation, but what are you going to do? Where's the counter argument?" And I thought about that a long time, and I thought, oh my gosh, I know what it is. It's how can you have creativity in the midst of the most devastating circumstance you can think of? And so that's how I got into Holocaust studies and music and terrorism, and I revisited the spirituals from that lens, and it made a lot of sense. I mean, what is it in a human that is so beaten down and so degraded that can come up with this?
Mm.
If you don't believe in God after that, well, then, it's all lost on you because you're never going to get it.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Barb. It was a wonderful after dinner Lenten.
Excellent, just excellent.
Good.
Great way
Well,
to
thanks, Scott, for being my wingman.
Absolutely. I was glad to do it. I almost lost my dinner with that spinning photo in the final video. I was like, what's going on here?
Oh, it's broken. It's broken. Oh my gosh.
Good night,
Well,
everyone.
Good night, everybody.
Leslie.
Thank you for
Thank
coming.
you
very much.
You're
It was
welcome.
beautiful.
I'm glad you
Thank
enjoyed
you.
it.
It was beautiful.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Peace be with
I'm
you.
glad you recorded it.
Yeah, I am too. I know Sue West and a couple of other people couldn't tune in tonight, and they were